This presentation is going to descend from the last presentation where we discussed about the brain and cranial nerves, and we will look at where the rest of the central nervous system will connect to that medulla oblongata and the pons and the brainstem and move back up into the central nervous system. So this is all basically going to deal with the spinal column itself and the specific plexus that are going to arise from certain regions of the spinal column to give rise to the peripheral nervous system that reaches out to the rest of the parts of the body. So all things are going to give us our sensory and motor functionality, allowing us to pick up stimuli from the environment and then to respond accordingly to those stimuli. So by the end of the presentation, you all will be able to identify the basic structure of the spinal column. You'll be able to distinguish different conduction pathways and the functions that they have and why they are the way that they are. And we'll talk about ways in which these conduction pathways will desiccate, or what we call cross over the midline. And again, establishing why, as we discussed in the last chapter, that the right hemisphere of your brain will control the left hemisphere of your body in most instances. We will also then discuss those nerve plexuses in more specific details and what they specifically are going to innervate. A lot of the names will basically tell you what they're going to innervate specifically. Again, things like the sacral region, the brachial region, and things of the sort. We'll also trace and explain the pathway of different reflex arcs and talk to you the importance about that. Again, of establishing where the sensory information is picked up on those afferent pathways, and then the afferent pathway sends it into the spinal column and then potentially to the spinal column into the brain and then back down and then out the efferent pathways into a motor neuron. And then finally, we will identify some common nerve damage disorders that you will potentially see if you are moving into the medical field. So to start off, let's take a look at the spine and have an overview of what the spine looks like. This is the structural and also physiological, what we consider again functional connection between the brain and the rest of the body. So again, this will give us a roadmap, if you will, to provide all of the control functionality that our brain provides the entirety of the body, a pathway to get down there. So again, all that being done is through reflex arcs, and that's basically again picking up signals from the rest of the body, either visceral, i.e., meaning interior, or organs and things of sort like that, or somatic, being on the outside, which would be all your exterior things like your skin receptors, tactile receptors, your smell receptors, and certain things like that. But with that in mind, you can see here we do have 31 pairs of these specific spinal nerves. They are going to have one for each side of the body, and they're named with the letter of the vertebral column region in which they're going to attach or descend from. And you see here that will basically go from the top with C1 and go the whole way down to our S5 or our sacral 5 vertebrae, which we have an according spinal cord part for that, a spinal nerve area. There are 4 parts to this, and these specific parts will also give rise to most of these plexus that will come through them. The spinal cord and column itself has a cervical region, the thoracic region, the lumbar region, and the sacral region. These 4 individual aspects are going to be nomenclatured to go along with the spinal column itself. So again, the vertebral column that we talked about with the bones chapter, they're going to be named along and go in coordination with each other. But the idea here is that the preferential areas and given more functionality are going to be the areas that have more nerve plexuses in them, and that's going to be the areas where you see with cervical and the lumbar enlargements, and you see those down here. And the reason that we have those is that not only are these areas going to also be giving some innervation to areas inside the torso, but they're also going to be innervating your appendages. So the cervical enlargement will give us additional neurons that are coming out and ascending, if you will, from the spinal column to the torso and the shoulder, but then also the whole way down into your arm. So again, including things like your radial nerve, the ulnar nerves, all the things that we have talked about with the bones and muscles in the lab, for instance. And then the same thing is seen with the lumbar enlargement, where you're going to have all of them coming out for the pelvis, but also your lower appendage of your leg, and things like your femoral nerve, your deep fibular nerve, all things of the sort like that. With that in mind, then we can take a look at what these spinal nerves look like and get a little bit of an idea of what the structure is. So again, this is kind of more of an anatomy area, but at the same time, this anatomy is important for the understanding of knowing what exactly is being done at each part of this neural structure of the spinal cord. So the spinal nerves themselves are basically going to be just like we had seen with muscle fibers. They are going to have an epi surrounding cover, an epineurium here. They'll also have an endoneurium and a perineurium. And basically the perineurium just surrounds all of our bundles into a bundle fiber. Or all of our fibers into a fiber bundle, rather. Got those two mixed up. But the idea again is that they have surrounding encapsulations, where basically they will then come together and converge into roots from what are called rootlets. And if you look at the image on the right-hand side there, the spinal column is that centralized column, and you see these kind of root-like structures. That would be the actual rootlets here. And as they're going to converge together as they move away from the spinal column itself, they will then converge into much larger roots that then form our peripheral nervous system nerve fibers. Specifically, though, looking at it, you can see on that image as well that you have rootlets stemming from the anterior portion and also rootlets stemming from the anterior portion, or the anterior and the posterior portion. They're both going to be coming in contact with the centralized gray matter that we have within the spinal column here. And the reason for that is that that's actually going to be the one carrying all of those sensory nerve informations and those motor nerve informations to and from the brain to give us our control center functionality that the brain possesses. And you can see here the posterior root is what's going to have all the sensory neurons there, which means that anytime that we pick up a signal, say again that our body is getting hot from the environment around, or you put your hand on a hot stove, something like that, all those afferent neurons are going to be bringing that signal to the posterior aspect of the rami, if you will, of the spinal column via those now diverging, in this instance, diverging roots into rootlets that will then give us the connection to the spinal cord. And then once we figure out what to do with that stimuli, we'll then send the signal back down into the anterior root, and then that will give us the control of all of our motor neurons. And again, that can either be glandular tissue, it can be muscle tissue, any number of different things like that, that basically is going to cause a change in our body to help us to adapt or control or regulate whatever the stimuli is that we are receiving via the posterior rootlets. But the idea here again too is that a lot of these things are going to be bundled together via that perineurium into what are called mixed nerves. And if you recall from the cranial nerves, some of the ones that we had are actually going to be both motor and sensory. And the reason is that's because they have both efferent and afferent neurons coming down the exact same tract because they're bundled together via that perineurium. And then I said that this is going to be composed of gray matter versus white matter. All the things that we're talking about in terms of conduction is going to be the gray matter that you see here. And we call that the horns. We have basic little protrusions, if you will, in the medial aspect of the spinal column. And those horns are going to be important because they, again, are going to be receiving sensory information at the posterior side. So again, the posterior horn is the posterior part of the spinal column. And as we just said last slide, that posterior spinal column picks up all the sensory information. So that will give us all of our somatic, like I said, from the skin and muscles, and all of our visceral. So again, all things of our organs and internal regulatory processes. The anterior and lateral horns, though, are going to be more so for our motor functionality. And you can see there, somatic motor functionality is the anterior horn, and that's what we really want to consider to be the motor functionality of the anterior rootlets that come into the spinal column. But the lateral horns also have motor control as well, but that's more the autonomic functionality. And as you're looking at the images on the right-hand side, you can see that color coordination on the top image and the right-hand side of that, where you can see the red is that somatic coloration, whereas your yellow is going to be that autonomic. So again, things like digestive system, motor functionality to continue propelling your food forward, controlling, again, dilation of your blood vessels. That's all, again, autonomic functions. You don't have to think about that. But looking at your somatic sensory and your visceral sensories, those are going to be in the purplish blue and the aquaish blue colors on the posterior side. So again, you can see exactly what is receiving signals in from where and how they're going to then thusly travel up and down the spinal column, moving through these posterior, anterior, and lateral horns. But then the rest of the spinal column is then comprised of what's considered to be white matter, or what we call light matter. And this basically is just going to be myelinated axons to and from the brain. So they're receiving all the information from the gray matter from the peripheral nervous system. And basically from there, we will then transmit signals up and down the spinal column, not only with the gray matter as well, but it will flow through the white matter or the white matter as well. And that goes through something called funiculuses. And basically what these are going to basically do is give us these ascending and descending tracks that we would see. And again, related to the anatomical positioning of the spinal column, they'll either be related to motor or sensory functionalities. Again, posterior is always going to be pretty much related to our sensory tracks. Our lateral and our anteriors are pretty much going to be related to motor tracks, but you see we do get some sensory tracks as well, depending on which way we're going. With the lateral and anterior, your ascending tracks are all going to be sensory, but all of your descending tracks are going to be motor. And if you're kind of confused as to why that is, or trying to look for a good way to understand that, when we start talking about the reflex arcs, it makes much more sense, because again, when we receive a stimuli, or what's considered a sense or a sensory information signal, it comes in and up to the brain, and then we want to react to that stimuli. We send the signal down and then out. So again, anything motor descends the spinal column, anything sensory or stimuli related ascends and goes up. So from there, then you can talk about the conduction pathways. These are going to basically be the things we were just talking about. And again, the entire premise to this is that these things are going to be important for our reflex arcs to conduct signals from the peripheral nervous system, either visceral or somatic, and then send a signal to the brain so that we can adjust to that and make a change to maintain homeostasis or correct something that was taking us away from homeostasis. You notice here that each of these pathways we'll talk about is made up of a chain of 2 or more neurons. Some of them will be 3 or more past that, but some of them just have a simplistic chain of 2. And what this basically means is that you're going to have a synapse, like we had talked about in chapter 12, where your 2 neurons will have a neurotransmitter connection in between them in that synaptic cleft that will have them to activate one or another to convey this signal up or down the spinal column. But what you notice here again is that these are going to decussate, which means basically send information from one side of the body across the midline of the spinal column, or even potentially up into the brain in some aspects, and we'll see that as we go, to basically allow the opposite hemisphere of our brain to control the opposite side of the body. So again, left hemisphere controls the right side of your body, and right hemisphere controls the left side of your body. And these 2 pathways are all going to basically be exactly how we had seen with both anterior and posterior, where we do have a sensory pathway and we then have a motor pathway. And again, all sensory pathways lead up the spinal column, and all of your motor pathways lead down the spinal column. Again, motor signals are sent away to cause an action with muscles. All of your sensory are picked up from your senses and sent to the brain to tell you about the space around you. So to start off, we can look at the sensory pathway, and basically everything we're going to have in terms of senses comes from our 5 senses. You have either tactile, you have your smell, taste, vision, and hearing, but we can also throw in with tactile receptors the idea of proprioceptors as well. And again, what those are basically doing is giving us an rough estimate of what some people will call the 6th sense of our positioning of our body within space and time. It kind of gives us the ability to have awareness of where everything is. So for instance, right now, if you were told to put your finger on your nose, you can easily do that because your eyes will trace the finger to your nose. But if you were to close your eyes and someone said, hey, do the same thing and put your finger on your nose, there's a small chance that you might actually overshoot the positioning and move to the side of your nose or above the nose or below the nose. And that's because basically you're relying on these proprioceptors rather than the visual receptors. So again, we do have that kind of 6th sense that helps us when we don't have the ability to use the rest of our 5 senses. But the idea here again is that the sensory input is transmitted through the spinal column, and it originates from general sense receptors that we have usually through our senses of touch. So again, the tactile ones are there first. You can basically feel any object around you currently while you're listening to the recording, whether it be a cup, whether it be your bed comforter, the carpeting, whatever couch you might be sitting on. That's going to give some kind of signal to your brain by utilizing your tactile receptors and then send it to your brain so that you understand basically what you are encountering within the environment. And then how does that do that? Well, it has a three neuron pathway. So instead of being 2+, we now have 3. We have a primary neuron for that, a secondary neuron, and then a tertiary neuron. And where they're going to be specifically located will depend specifically what we're going to on specifically where and what kind of signal we're going to be looking at. So for this one, your primary neuron is always, and not even just for this one, but the primary neuron is always going to be out in the peripheral nervous system, being attached to whatever tactile or proprioceptor is receiving the signal from the environment. It's going to be having the ending out in, again, the posterior root somewhere around your fingertips. And then that will send the signal toward the body down its axon terminal to that secondary neuron. And we call that secondary neuron an interneuron. And that basically is going to be the connection pathway between the primary neuron and the tertiary neuron. And that will then lead us to the tertiary neuron that will then be within the spinal column, or it can even potentially lead us into the cerebrum by itself if it were a 2-neuron system. But then even technically, if you then go into the third neurons, that would give you another interneuron within that, because technically that interneuron is still going to connect you with neural tissue. And that will then either take you directly to the cerebellum, or it can extend you into the somatosensory cortex of the parietal lobe. And the reason for that, again, is that as we had talked about in the last chapter, the parietal lobe, and specifically that post-central gyrus, is the area for which all of your somatosensory processing comes from. If you need a second, go ahead and pause the video and refer to that homunculus that shows us just exactly how much information is processed for different regions of the body. And again, as you move away from, say, your hands and face down towards like your torso and your legs, they become less and less innervated by these sensory neurons, what you have in your hands and your face. So with that in mind, then take a look at the posterior funiculus first. The funiculus on the posterior side, again, is all sensory signalings. And the idea for this, again, is that it's going to give us all of our input about touch and perception of our body positioning through the proprioceptors. And we call this one specifically discriminative touch. And basically that means things that you choose to interact with. Indiscriminate means that it's any kind of touch that would be there. You're not trying to decipher what it is. This is specifically trying to figure out what you are touching versus, again, say something grazing up against your arm. You just need to know that something touched you. That's indiscriminate touch. You touching a carpet and trying to figure out what kind of carpet or fabric made up that carpet, that's discriminative touch. But that starts again with a primary neuron, relays us from the stimuli receivers, which again would be the tactile receptors in your fingertips. That axon will then carry the signal to the secondary neuron in the medulla oblongata. So at this point here, what you're basically noticing is that we're going to run from our fingertips the whole way up to the arm directly into the medulla oblongata. And at that point, we're then going to run into our secondary neuron in the medulla oblongata, which will then have us decussate across the midline of the medulla oblongata to the opposite side. And then that will then make contact with the tertiary neuron on the opposite side of the medulla oblongata that will then travel us up to the primary somatosensory cortex in that parietal lobe. And then that will enable us to process that specific tactile receptor that we had seen. Specifically, again, if you look at that homunculus, that would be more so located on the 2 o'clock positioning, just like you see in the image here at the very top right where it says primary somatosensory cortex. That is about exactly where the hand positioning was on that somatosensory homunculus that we had seen in the previous chapter. If you then look at the anterolateral funiculus, again, these are going to be related to some functionalities related to sensory signals. Again, here you're talking about crude touch, which again is indiscriminate, means that again, we're not really worried about what is touching us and figuring out exactly what it was, but just ensuring that we understand the idea that something did touch us. It's more of an alert system than an identification system. It will also give us some pressure sensations and temperature as well. It also runs on a three neuron pathway. The primary neuron, again, will still lie within the skin and transmit that signal to the spinal cord. Now, this time we're not going directly up the spinal cord into the medulla oblongata, but instead we're going to meet our secondary neuron within the spinal cord. That will then connect us from the spinal cord up to the thalamus, where the thalamus will then connect us to our primary somatosensory cortex, again, in that procentral gyrus. So what you're noticing here is that the decussate is not necessarily going to be within the medulla oblongata, but instead will cross the midline right immediately as it gets in contact with the spinal column from that primary neuron. The primary neuron hits the secondary neuron right within the spinal column, and that secondary neuron takes you directly across to the other side of the spinal column and then travels you the whole entire way up to the thalamus here. And then the thalamus will then give you the third neuron, which is colored in green on the image on the right-hand side, and that takes you to the primary somatosensory cortex. So again, purple is your primary, your bluish coloration is going to be your secondary neuron, and then the green coloration will then be your tertiary neuron. You can also then look at the spinocerebellar funiculus, and this one is going to have one less neuron involved. It's only going to have a primary and a secondary. The secondary is still going to be an interneuron. However, again, it's not going to interneuron connect itself with something else to get to the brain. It's going to connect us directly to the brain itself, specifically to the cerebellum. So what does this do for us? Well, specifically, this is related to proprioception. And again, this is the idea, as we had said, about maintaining balance and homeostasis and understanding that we need to be aware of where our body is within the environment which we are existing. So the primary neuron is still going to be within the skin, but it will act to directly connect to the secondary neuron in the spinal cord, which will then shoot your signal directly up through the spinal column. And this is one of those specific times where our conduction pathway is not going to cross the midline, but will instead remain what we call ipsilateral and will not go and cross over to the opposite side. So what you're going to end up seeing here is that this will still help us to control one side of the body versus the other side with parts of the brain. But what we're going to actually end up seeing is that specifically, since we're talking about the cerebellum rather than the cerebrum, there really is no differentiation of how it works. The cerebellum just controls both sides of the brain. It's not like the cerebrum. The cerebellum is different. Then you can move to the motor pathways. So again, at this point, we're talking more anterior functionality. We are looking for now the ability for us to take the signal that we had received from those sensory pathways and now process it and send a signal back down the body and again adjust to that specific stimuli that we had received. So we're always going to be starting at the brain at this point and then again having two or more neurons as we travel through. And we have what's called an upper motor neuron and then a lower motor neuron. And basically at this point, the upper motor neuron is the starting point, just like we had with our primary neuron and sensories. The upper motor neuron will have us traveling down the spinal column from the brain, where we can then come in contact with the lower motor neuron within the spinal column to then travel out and then excite some muscle or glandular tissue. So the direct pathway we can look at first for that. We're going to have lateral or anterior corticospinal tracts. And the functionality of this is that these can either be ipsilateral or they can be desiccate in terms of them passing over the midline or not. But the idea is that where they do it will be the questionality, because you may see from the image on the right-hand side that, well, technically right now you see that, well, one of those pathways is going to decussate and cross the midline there in the medulla oblongata. And well, why didn't the other one in terms of the anterior corticospinal tract? Well, if you go down to the next step of the spinal column, the anterior tract will also decussate in the spinal column and travel over to the opposite side. So again, this is why we say all functionality of the brain in terms of the control of the body is going to be from one side of the lobe to the other side of the brain. So look at the lateral one first. You notice that the upper motor neuron axon is going to cross over the midline within the medulla oblongata, like we just said. The axon forms the tracks in the lateral funiculi and then contacts the lower motor neurons within the spinal column. And then from that spinal column, you then hit that secondary lower neuron and travel out and then connect to whatever skeletal muscle you want to have activated. That will then lead us to having a muscle contraction to cause you to pull your hand off the hot stove. The anterior one, though, again, is only different because the crossing over point is different. We're not going to have the crossing over occurring in the medulla oblongata like we saw with the lateral tract, but instead it will occur in the spinal column as you get down to the part where your lower motor neuron is going to be located, where you're then going to be able to cross out of the body. So again, that's going to cross over at the spinal column and not medulla oblongata. The indirect pathways, though, are a little bit different. They're a little more complicated route to get to the spinal column here. Not going to talk too much about them. Just make sure you can understand the differences as we have them presented to you here. You're still going to always have your upper motor neuron being presented first from the brain, and then where they go from that will depend on which specific type of pathway you're taking. You see the lateral pathway will help us with vasomotor tone in our flexor limb muscles, whereas say your tectospinal one will help us with the visual and auditory stimuli in helping us to orient our body based off of the visualizations in which we're getting. So that's what we kind of call your reflex, like a knee-jerk reflex. If someone throws a ball at your face, you kind of quickly move away. That's that tectospinal tract. The vestibulospinal tract is helping us with a lot of balance things and a lot of things in helping us change positions. So again, going from a sitting position to a standing position, or going from standing to a walking, or walking to a sitting, it will help us to navigate our body throughout the environment and have smooth muscle motor control as we change from one process or one position to another. We can then move into and look at the nerve plexus as well. And these, again, we break down into 4 different sections. The first one you have is going to be that cervical plexus. And you can see there, it is based out of your cervical rami, or the cervical vertebrae that will come out through. And basically all these plexuses are going to be is that they will come out and then branch out into multiple different nerves, and then all these nerves will then combine back in and go back into these same plexuses. But specifically here, the more important thing that I want you to understand is what these specific plexuses are going to do. So looking at it here, they innervate all of our anterior neck muscles, which makes sense because that's the anatomical region in which they're located, in the cervical region of the spinal cord. But it's also good for portions of the head and shoulders, and also the diaphragm. And the diaphragm is very, very important. The very bottom one that you have coming off of that split and combination of your C3 and C4s and C5s, that gives you what we consider to be your phrenic nerve. And the phrenic nerve is what stimulates, again, autonomically, but also sometimes consciously, the activation to breathe in or breathe out, maintaining your respiratory rates. And again, that's a good thing because we don't have to think about that. It is an autonomic functionality, but we can override that. You then have the brachial plexus, which is going to be the next section down. That goes from your C5 to your T1. Generally speaking, not a very big area, but it does service a lot of regions within the shoulder and the arm. And you can see why that is, because they branch out and give us all of the nerves that we had talked about within the upper extremity presentations in the muscles in lab. You have the axillary nerve, which is going to give rise to all of the shoulder muscles that we're looking for in terms of major functionality. So the deltoid there and the teres majors. So again, helping us with abduction and posterior retractions. You have the median nerve, which goes to a lot of your anterior forearm muscles. Again, anterior being all the ones on the flexion side. So again, things talking with bringing your fingers and your thumb closer together. You also get some input from the palmar and dorsal fingertips as well. So again, that can help us with some sensations. You then get your musculocutaneous nerve, which this one is good for your anterior upper arm. So talking more so about your biceps innervations and also some sensory input from the forearm as well. And then you have your radials and ulnars, which again is going to innervate a bunch of your forearm muscle groupings. You can then move into the lumbar plexus, and the lumbar plexus is going to be located more so or inferiorly from where we were at before. So we're going to travel through all those thoracic vertebrae and into the lumbar region. It'll go basically from L1 through L4 and give us all of the innervation like we had seen with the brachial plexus, but specifically here, we're going to talk now more so about the leg. So it gives rise to two major nerves. You have the femoral nerve, which gives rise to the majority of your muscles in the upper thigh, again, more so the posterior division. So things like your sartorius will be there. You're looking at your um, uh, uh, vastus lateralis or medius or medial lateral or vastus lateralis, vastus medialis, and your rectus femoris. Whereas your obturator nerve will be more so an anterior division for the plexus here, and also giving you some medial thigh muscle controls that we had seen before. Some smaller nerve plexuses will arise as you move more distally down the leg, but also some will go more anteriorly and superiorly into the abdominal wall. And that can help us with control of things related to, as you see, external genitalia in terms of arousal and also erection in males. Your sacral plexus would be the fourth one that we have. That's going to be the very last plexus that we have. And this one will give rise to lower parts of the leg, so now tibial and fibular areas. And that will basically give rise to what we call the sciatic nerve. And the sciatic nerve is the longest nerve within the body. And that's formed from portions of anterior and posterior sacral plexuses. So we're going to bring not only the anterior side and the posterior sides that we had seen in the previous slide together and have us run the entire length of the leg, but it will then also help us to create innervations into the distal aspect of the leg. And that will give us our fibular nerve, our peroneus nerve, however you want to name that, and it will also give us our tibial nerve. And specifically speaking here, that will give us the innervations for things like some aspects of the bicep femoris and also the lateral and medial plantar nerves that will go into our foot. So it helps us with our activations of all of our dorsiflexions and plantar flexions that we had seen before. There will be some sensory functionalities here, but keep in mind that you have a lot less tactile receptors in your legs and feet as compared to what you had in your hands. So refer back to that homunculus that we had seen before, and you would notice that again, the feet take up a very, very small portion. And that's because, again, we don't have that much sensory functionality, but we do have a lot of sensory functionality in terms of things like touch and pain, but they're much more widespread out. If you put a pin on the tip of your fingertip, you can feel precisely where that was. Whereas if you put a pin on the ball of your foot, it has a little bit larger of a radius of where that pain might actually resonate for you. But it's still going to be much more succinct and closer in proximity to what it would be like, say, if you took a pin and jabbed yourself in the back. And that's because the nerve endings are a lot less numerous in the back than, say, your feet. And this is why they say getting tattoos on your torso is probably one of the least painful areas to get it. And that's because there's less nerve endings there. Medical importance for this then would be talking about some common nerve injuries that you might come in contact with either in nursing or in PT or OT. And the first one would be sciatica. That is the big one, right? That's the biggest nerve that we have. Compression to this nerve can cause extreme pain down the entire length of your posterior leg. So again, down the buttocks, down the thigh, down the calf area. It can basically cause radiating pain the entire way up and down, or it can basically cause pinpointed pains at different locations, but it's all related to compression of this specific nerve bundle from these plexuses that we were talking about. Now, what actually caused that compression could be a number of different things. It could be inflammation because of an infection. It could be overuse and some muscles are pinching it off, but more so the common occurrence that we would see for that would be herniated intervertebral discs. And what that will basically do is apply pressure to that sciatic nerve at the spinal column, and then thusly then it will pinch off that nerve, causing pain more distally down the length of the sciatic nerve itself. You can also have common injuries to other nerves as well, and this is just more so a generic umbrella to cover all the rest of the nerves. But basically, anything that it gets severed or compressed, any kind of injuries like that, will basically cause pain in that region. If it gets compressed or if it gets severed, you can lose all sensory or motor functionality to that region. And this is where we talk about things like paralysis, for instance. Individuals that uh, had their spinal cord severed at like the L1 vertebrae, for instance, those individuals will lose all sensory functionality and motor functionality below that L1 vertebrae because that spinal cord is no longer able to conduct signals to and from those regions, which of course means that they now are paralyzed from the waist down and they cannot feel any pain from that region either. So again, they will lose the function of the muscles and they'll lose the sensation of those areas. But we can also use um, some of these nerves for testing purposes as well. You see here hypoactive reflex versus a hyperactive reflex. Depending on what we perceive and have tested through multiple, experiments, like, over the course of centuries, we know what a normal reflex to specific stimuli should look like. And if you do not uh, present the desired or expected response to the stimuli that's applied, then you're said to have a hypoactive reflex. And that may indicate damage either to your spinal cord or to the specific neuron, or to the neuron that connects to the muscle, the connection to that neuromuscular junction between the muscle and that neuron. And that can basically be indicative of some kind of trauma that has occurred to the individual. So, for instance, if you I don't know, for instance, if you need to have like a sensory signal sent from a leg that was crushed in a car accident or something, and they try to uh, tap on your calf, and they said, "Hey, do you feel that?" And you say no. Well, then that obviously means that your reflex is hypoactive or maybe non-existent at all, and that means again that you had some kind of injury, probably to the neuron in the leg, but potentially how bad the car accident was. Maybe you might be paralyzed from a vertebral column issue as well. Now, on the opposite side, you can also have hyperactive reflexes where you have an abnormally strong reflex to a specific stimuli. And generally, this is not always a bad thing, but sometimes it can also indicate some spinal cord damage, or even realistically a brain damage. And realistically, why that is because you're over activating two specific stimuli, and we have uh, specific things like autonomic dysreflexia, for instance, is a good example where, depending on specific stimuli, like maybe extreme cold, your body might overreact or react very quickly to these stimuli before they realistically have to. And a common one for auto dysreflexia is, with extreme cold, is that you will have your vasoconstriction happen very quickly and very severely to the point where you actually get pain in your hands, and you can actually start seeing your hands turn blue because of the blood being occluded because of how strong the vasoconstriction ends up being, due to this hyper reaction to the reflex arc of your body sensing that the air around it is cold. And then to finalize with that, we can tie in with what we are just talking about with reflex arcs of picking up different stimuli and senses to then figure out how we are going to regulate the control from that. And we then call these reflexes. And reflexes are basically going to be rapid, pre-programmed, involuntary survival responses. And again, survival response is just a long way of saying that we are trying to maintain homeostasis and maintain the health and viability of our person and our individual. These reflexes are always going to be rapid, and sometimes they may travel the entire way to the brain, but sometimes they may only go to the spinal cord and back. And that's what we call some things spinal cord reflexes rather than just reflexes in general. But the important real aspect about this is that all of your reflexes are going to be considered involuntary. And that means that you cannot stop them from occurring. Once the specific stimuli has been applied to any part of your body, unless you have damage to the neural connections or to the neural connection to the muscle, the neuromuscular junction, you should see the response that should be there. You cannot stop this. This is all autonomic. But again, since it is a survival mechanism, we should see an immediate response to detrimental issues or to potential threats in the area. So again, if you were to put your hand on a scalding hot stove because you were just leaning over talking to someone, you will get a pain and also heat receptor sensation in your uh, afferent neurons. They will send a signal via that primary neuron into the posterior aspect of the spinal column where the sensory signals are being picked up. That again will follow through the secondary neuron pathway up to the primary somatosensory cortex via that third interneuron, and that will then send us a signal back down via our upper motor neuron that will then connect to the lower motor neuron and back out to the muscle that will cause you then to pull your arm off. And again, that's a lot of steps occurring, but this happens within milliseconds because this is how important this is for an immediate response to avoid serious injury or death even potentially being the case. And again, it's not always for skeletal muscles. It could be for control of other things like constriction of your blood vessels to keep blood going to the surface or keep blood going to your vital organs depending what environment you are currently residing in. But that entire uh, uh, process that I just explained is exactly what you see in the image on the right hand side, and that's what we refer to as a reflex arc. And those reflex arcs are going to be basically composed of going in and going out. So the sensory pathway is going in, that's the first half of your reflex arc, and the motor pathway is the signal going back out, and that's going to be your adjustment to the stimuli what you had just received. So again, descending from the spinal cord to the motor pathway, ascending to the spinal cord or up into the brain for the sensory pathways. So then how can we classify these? Well, technically, the ones that really matter is the top two and realistically the fourth one. I mean, we care about whether or not they are going to um, cross over to one side or the other. And we do care about how many neurons are going to be at play here, but realistically, what you really want to know is whether or not something is going to be a spinal nerve or a cranial nerve. And basically, the reason for this is that if something is labeled a spinal reflex versus a cranial nerve reflex, that means the spinal reflex is much faster than what the cranial nerve is. It has to cover a much shorter distance, which means that this specific reflex is even more vitally important to your survival than, say, a different reflex that goes to the brain. So, again, going back to the idea of putting your hand on a hot stove, that is a spinal cord reflex. It will not go the entire way up because your spinal cord has enough information to know that that pain receptor and that extreme heat receptor means that that's bad for you. We don't need to go up and process that in the primary somatosensory region of the brain. We don't need to do that. Somatic and visceral is also an important aspect, though, because this will tell us whether or not things are being related to, again, tactile or appropriate reception, or if it has to deal with things like your cardiac muscles, the smooth muscles, or glandular tissues. So, again, things like your pancreas, for instance, would be a visceral type of a reflex to an increase in the amount of glucose in your bloodstream. And again, that will go up to a cranial reflex as well, because that will go to the brain first, which then causes us to have a production of insulin from the pancreas once we send a signal back down. Innate or acquired is also one that's interesting. Innate basically meaning that you were born with the reflex. It's something that you have always had, whether or versus an acquired reflex where basically you developed it after birth. A lot of things that they will test your newborn child for along outside of, again, like vitamin K deficiencies and certain birth defects will be their reflexology. And the reality with this is that they're trying to make sure that the nervous system had developed fully and properly while in the womb. And they will test out certain different reflexes within the body. And a lot of the common ones that people will know about just from going to the doctor's office when you were a kid is them using the little orange hammer on your patellar tendon. That is going to be an innate reflex. You didn't develop it over time, but basically what happens is when you tap that patellar tendon just distally to where the patella is, that will then activate a stretch receptor, which we'll talk about that here in a couple slides coming up, within that patellar tendon, which that will trigger your body into thinking that your patellar tendon is at risk for snapping. So what it will do, or being stretched too far to the point where it will snap. So what it will then do is cause a contraction of your um, vastus lateralis and vastus medialis, and your rectus femoris to contract and pull your leg forward. So when you dangle your foot over that lab bench or that doctor's office table and they tap it, what ends up happening is that all those muscles in your quad at the anterior side are going to contract, and then that pulls your foot anteriorly and causes it to extend. That's an innate reflex. And again, that's going to be a very, very important one for us because we don't want to have harmful tears in our skeletal muscle systems because, again, that can be very detrimental. So with that in mind, we can tie that into these different types of reflexes that we have. And this is what we're going to finish up with for the presentation. A stretch reflex is one of the first ones out that we have. And this reflex is important to ensure that we do not have a stretch go too far. So if you try to overextend a muscle or hyperextend it, this reflex will kick in to ensure that we do not tear that muscle in half, if you will. So the idea here is that when the muscle is stretched, like say you're going to do a I don't know, we'll use the biceps and triceps as the example. When you try and do a tricep extension and you put your hand out into a full anatomical positioning, well, that's stretching your bicep out while your tricep is contracting and pulling your arm backwards and your hand backwards. Well, if we didn't have the old Cranon process there and we didn't have all the ligaments, or if someone even came by and tried to jam your arm forward or further back rather, what would end up happening is that the bicep would stretch beyond where it's supposed to. And then what ends up happening is that proprioceptors within the biceps and the tendons that are there will basically become activated. So basically that will then cause an impulse to fire into the spinal cord, and then the spinal cord will then activate an alpha motor neuron in the same muscle group that will then cause it to contract so that it doesn't stretch any further. So basically what happens is once it gets stretched too far, a signal will be sent from the biceps sensory neuron, these proprioceptors, to the spinal cord, and then from the spinal cord back down to the bicep, and then cause it to contract. That way it ensures that basically the muscle hangs on tight and doesn't allow it to overstretch from where it should be, again, causing damage to that. And what you'll notice here is that while this occurs, we're going to have a simultaneous inhibitor functionality to the muscle group that is potentially causing this damage to occur. So again, we said we're using triceps and biceps. As the tricep is continuing to contract, if it could contract any further, again, if the old Cranon process wasn't there, it would potentially pull that arm backwards. Well, once the stretch receptor gets activated within the bicep in these proprioceptors, that will also send an inhibiting signal to the tricep and tell it to stop contracting so that we don't pull the arm backwards any more than it is. And we call that reciprocal inhibition. And we classify this specific stretch reflex as a spinal somatic monosynaptic ipsilateral innate, meaning that we're not going to cause it to cross over the spinal cord, so it has to cross back over. It's basically going to be as quick as possible. We don't need to go to the brain for it because, again, if we take any more time than what it needs to have, it could potentially cause damage that we don't want to have. And again, with it being part of the skin and muscles, that makes it somatic. So again, that's what we're talking about. The Golgi tendon reflex ties along with this specific same functionality here, but instead of talking about the muscle fibers, we're more so talking about the tendons now. And this will basically stop you from having excessive contraction. So what ends up happening here is a similar type of a process where you're still going to have proprioceptors within your muscle and the tendons, but the tendons here at this point are going to prevent you from having contraction to the point where you might be pulling your muscle off of the bone. So when it gets to a certain pressure limit, excessive tension being applied, if you will, against the load, what it will basically do is send an inhibitory signaling to the spinal cord and then send it from the spinal cord back to that same muscle, causing it to stop the contraction. And this is basically what happens when your arm gets too fatigued to hold up a weight any longer. What ends up happening is your spinal cord tells your arm or your leg or whatever you're doing to basically drop the load, and you basically will cause your muscle to relax. And the entire premise to this is that the relaxation of the muscle will prevent any excessive damage that would otherwise cause your tendon to rip off of the bone. Again, remember the avulsions that we talked about in the bone chapter, or cause you to have a tear within the muscle fibers, or cause your muscle to tear off from the tendon itself. Very, very important for that. What you would also notice too with this again is that for us to also aid in the relaxation of this muscle, we're going to have the opposite of the reciprocal inhibition that we had seen the last time, where we're going to stop the opposing muscle group from contracting. And instead, we're going to actually activate that muscle group to help rebound and pull your arm back out, or pull your action muscle at this point back into a more relaxed status. So again, if we go and look at the biceps versus the triceps again, assume that you're carrying a really, really heavy load and you're activating your biceps really, really strongly. But you've been holding this load for a while, and now someone comes up and adds another 20 pounds of whatever on top of it. Well, that load now exceeds what your tendons think is safe for your arm. So it will send a signal again to the spinal cord. That spinal cord then sends a signal back to the biceps to drop it. That way the muscle can save itself. At the same time, it will send the reciprocal activation signal to the triceps to activate them and cause them to do a slight contraction that will also then help your bicep to drop and go back to the position that it was before. And again, you're seeing the exact same kind of reflex classification as we had seen with the stretch reflex before in the muscles. So again, we're just talking about different types of functionalities. Then we also have withdrawal reflex, and withdrawal reflex is what we were talking about with the hand on a hot stove. And now we can kind of put this into a classification. You know exactly what the pathway is now, so none of this should be new to you. But the idea is that we are going to try and have some self-preservation of our body based on pain or really, really cold or really, really hot sensations that we're getting. So the stimulus that we have basically will excite some sensory neuron that we have in our tactile receptors on the skin. That will then send a signal to the spinal column. That will then send a signal back to motor neurons and a neuromuscular junction to cause a muscle to have a contraction to change positioning of something within our body to pull it off of whatever the stimuli is. This could be, again, stepping on a nail. It could be anything like that. But the idea, again, is that the neurons are going to cause the contraction of that specific body part to pull it back off. And we're also going to have some reciprocal inhibitions of specific muscle groups that will cause us to have a relaxation of the muscle groups that would otherwise cause your contraction to stop. And what that basically means for us here, again, is if you put your hand on the burner of the stove and it's really hot, what ends up happening again is that the signal is sent to the spinal column via the sensories to the posterior part of the spinal cord. It interprets it very quickly, sends the motor signal back out the anterior side down to your bicep, and causes your bicep to do a bicep curl to pull your hand off really quickly. And at the same time as you're doing that contraction, it's sending the inhibitory signals to the triceps to inhibit them from doing their contractions that would otherwise stop your arm from doing the bicep curl to remove your hand. And that's basically what the inhibition aspect is for that one. Now, the cross extensor reflex kind of ties some of these things together. Again, I said the idea is like you could step on a nail with that last example for the withdrawal reflex, and that would cause your leg to have a contraction that would pull your foot off of that nail. Well, now we can take this a step further and add in an activation of the opposite side of the body, where we're actually going to have the contralateral or the decussate actions of these specific nerves. All the other ones have been ipsilateral to this point. So what's going to end up happening here, again, we'll use the example of stepping on fire or stepping on a nail, something like that. You're going to receive a pain signal at the bottom of your foot that will then get sent to the spinal cord. That spinal cord will then send an excitatory signaling to the muscles in that same leg where the pain is occurring to help you to lift and pull that leg and retract it off of the pain stimuli that it's receiving. At the same time, it's then going to send an activation to the opposite leg to allow it to then have activation to stand on. Because if you were to just inactivate both legs, you would fall over. Or if you were to withdraw this leg and inactivate the other one, you would also fall over. So the idea here is that we have to allow the opposite limb on the opposite side of the body to transition the weight of the rest of your torso and your arms and legs to that side so that you do not fall over. So very, very important for that. Now, at the same time, we're still seeing an inhibition signal being sent out to the leg that is receiving the pain stimuli, but that inhibition signaling again is going to specific muscle groups. So again, as we're looking here, at the muscles involved with causing flexion of the legs, we would want to be activating our biceps or our rectus femoris, rather, causing that flexion to take place. That would be getting the activation signaling to pull our leg off of the fire that you see here in this picture. But we'd be getting an inhibitory signal being sent to the hamstrings, i.e., our semitendinosus, our semimembranosus, and our biceps femoris, to ensure that they're not activated to keep your leg down in the extended position. And at the same time, we're also sending the activation over to the left leg in this image to ensure that we can withstand the weight of the body onto that leg instead. We transition the weight at that point. So that's all we have for the presentation for this week. If you have any questions, feel free to send me an email or bring questions to the next class or stop by office hours.